Good evening, dear listener. Tonight, we travel back to a time long forgotten, to the dark and chaotic streets of Georgian London, where the sweet smell of juniper and despair filled the air. It was a time when the city was drowning, not in water, but in gin. London's people, from the poorest beggar to the common worker, lived in a haze of drunken madness. The story begins with good intentions, as many disasters do. When King William III of England, a Dutchman by birth, found his country at war with France, he needed to stop money from flowing to his enemies. French brandy was the drink of the English upper class, and every bottle sold helped France. To fight this, William promoted a new drink, gin, inspired by Dutch Genever, a juniper-flavored spirit. The government reduced taxes on domestic spirits and made gin easy to produce and sell. At first, it seemed brilliant. But within years, London was lost to an epidemic of addiction. Small distilleries popped up in basements and back alleys, and anyone with a few coins could get completely drunk for the price of bread. By 1730, there were more than 7,000 gin shops in London, one for every 85 people. The city had become a living distillery, a place where children learned the taste of alcohol before they could walk. The story of Judith Dufour shows how deep this madness ran. Judith was a poor silk worker who lived in Bethnal Green. She was addicted to gin but had no money to buy it. One cold morning in 1734, in a moment of pure desperation, she took her 2-year-old daughter Mary for a walk, strangled her, and sold the baby's clothes for gin money. When caught, Judith showed no emotion. She simply said she needed money for gin. The judge cried while sentencing her to death. Judith's story was not an exception. It was a mirror of London's soul at that time. Entire neighborhoods were filled with people who lived and died in drunken fogs. Mothers abandoned their children, fathers sold their possessions, and crime filled every street. St. Giles became one of the worst areas, known for violence, filth, and death. Streets were littered with unconscious bodies. Even 5-year-old children were seen drunk in the gutters. The air reeked of vomit and despair. Some people, however, saw profit in this chaos. Mary Young, known as Jenny Diver, used the city's drunkenness to build a criminal empire. She trained young women to work inside gin houses, charming and robbing wealthy drunk customers. Her network was vast, earning her wealth and power. Others like Thomas Bradshaw became rich by owning distilleries and gin shops. Bradshaw learned that addiction was the perfect business model. He sold gin cheaply, then bought properties from families who lost everything to drink, turning those same buildings into more gin shops. The poor grew poorer, and the rich became richer. Meanwhile, death rates in London rose sharply. Babies were dying before they could crawl, and pregnant women miscarried due to constant intoxication. In some areas, half of all children died before their 5th birthday. The city's population began to decline for the first time in centuries. The government finally tried to act. In 1729, Parliament passed the first Gin Act, hoping to control the disaster with taxes and licenses. But this only made things worse. Legal gin shops closed, while illegal ones multiplied in secret. Criminals took over the trade, and underground distilleries appeared everywhere. People like Sarah Malcolm used clever methods to sell untaxed gin, hiding bottles in laundry baskets and exchanging money in secret. But Sarah's greed led her into darker crimes, including murder. When she was caught and hanged, the crowd didn't see her as a monster. They saw her as one of their own, a victim of the same gin addiction that had destroyed the city's soul. As the years passed, the chaos deepened. Criminal gangs led by men like James Dalton controlled entire neighborhoods. They bribed officials, intimidated witnesses, and operated massive underground networks. Even the city's watchmen were often drunk themselves. The government's raids, led by magistrates like John Gonson, became useless displays, smashing barrels for show while the real distilleries continued to operate in secret. Corruption ran so deep that criminals often knew about raids before the police did. In this world of decay, new forms of cruelty emerged. Elizabeth Brownrigg, who ran a so-called children's workhouse, exploited abandoned and orphaned kids, forcing them into theft and prostitution to fund her operations. Many of these children were already damaged by gin before she even found them. Their innocence was gone before their childhood began. By the mid-18th century, London had become a city of ghosts, drunk, broken, and bleeding from its own mistakes. The streets were filled with bodies, crime was unstoppable, and morality seemed dead. Artists like William Hogarth painted scenes of Gin Lane, where mothers dropped babies while drinking, and houses collapsed from neglect. These were not exaggerations but reflections of daily life. The government's grand plan to replace French brandy with English gin had turned into a nightmare. A simple tax policy had unleashed a national tragedy that scarred Britain for generations. What began as an effort to boost the economy ended as one of the darkest social disasters in history, a time when an empire nearly destroyed itself at the bottom of a bottle. As the gin craze spiraled out of control, the British government found itself facing a city on the edge of collapse. The poor were dying in the streets, crimes had tripled within a decade, and even the army complained that they could not find enough sober men fit to serve. The cry for reform grew louder. Yet, fixing the mess wasn't easy. Every attempt to control the flow of gin met fierce resistance, not only from the drinkers but from the distillers, merchants, and landlords who had built their fortunes on this addiction. Many of them had powerful friends in politics, and they used bribery and influence to delay any real change. Meanwhile, the city's poor continued to drown their sorrows in cheap gin, unable or unwilling to stop. To many, gin had become the only comfort in a life of poverty, hunger, and hopelessness. When Parliament introduced a new Gin Act in 1736, it seemed like a step in the right direction. The law imposed massive taxes and required sellers to buy an expensive license costing £50, an impossible sum for small vendors. Overnight, thousands of legal gin shops shut down. But instead of ending the problem, this law pushed the entire trade underground. Illegal gin flooded the streets in even greater quantities. People brewed their own spirits at home, and smuggling became a booming business. Riots broke out, and mobs attacked government officials who tried to enforce the law. Gin sellers dressed as bakers, milkmen, and even street sweepers to disguise their operations. Secret stills operated in cellars, attics, and even behind church walls. The authorities were humiliated, and the 1736 Gin Act became one of the most hated laws in London's history. Within a few years, it was quietly abandoned. The government realized that harsh restrictions could not defeat an addiction that had already taken over an entire society. During this dark period, a few voices began to rise above the chaos. Moral reformers, artists, and writers started documenting the horrors of the gin age. One of the most powerful of them was the artist William Hogarth, whose famous engravings, Gin Lane and Beer Street, told the story of two Londons, one destroyed by gin, and one restored by wholesome beer. In Gin Lane, Hogarth showed mothers dropping their infants as they reached for another drink, houses collapsing from neglect, and skeletal figures dying in the streets. His work shocked the public and helped turn opinion against gin. Churches began preaching sermons about moral decay, calling gin the devil's drink. Doctors warned that it was destroying not just bodies but generations. Slowly, society began to see the gin craze for what it truly was, not a personal weakness, but a national disease. By the 1750s, the government decided to try again, this time with a smarter approach. The Gin Act of 1751 was less about punishment and more about control. Instead of impossible taxes, it targeted the supply chain, restricting the sale of gin to licensed taverns and reducing the number of small, independent sellers. Distillers could no longer sell directly to the public, and advertisements for gin were banned. At the same time, the government encouraged the production of beer and ale as safer alternatives. The effect was slow but real. Within a few years, gin consumption began to drop. The streets grew quieter. Death rates fell. Families started returning to church, and children once again filled the city's schools. The nightmare that had consumed a generation was finally beginning to fade. Yet the scars of the gin era never fully healed. The poverty and corruption it exposed would haunt London for centuries. The gap between the rich and poor, widened by addiction and exploitation, became the foundation for future social unrest. The gin craze had shown how easily good intentions could turn into disaster, how one government policy, meant to protect the nation's economy, nearly destroyed the moral heart of its greatest city. In the end, the fall of gin-soaked London was not just a story about alcohol. It was a story about power, greed, and human weakness. It showed how a society can lose its way when profit matters more than people, and when pain becomes so common that no one remembers what happiness feels like. The laughter that once filled the taverns of Georgian London had long since turned into the cries of broken families and the silence of empty homes. But from that silence rose a new awareness, that no city, no matter how powerful, can survive when its people forget what it means to be human. The years that followed the fall of the gin craze marked a slow but powerful transformation in British life. London began to rebuild itself from the ruins of its own excess. Families who had survived the dark decades of addiction slowly returned to work and faith. Churches reopened their doors, schools were rebuilt, and the poor once again became visible not as criminals, but as citizens in need of help. The same government that had once encouraged the sale of gin now began to understand that a city cannot stand on greed and neglect alone. New social programs were introduced, charities began feeding the hungry, and the first steps toward organized welfare appeared in the streets where drunken chaos once ruled. The government, frightened by what had happened, also began modernizing law enforcement, creating stronger courts and the first foundations of the professional police. The madness of gin had not just destroyed lives, it had forced a nation to rethink how it governed, how it cared for its people, and how fragile civilization truly was. But even as London began to recover, the memory of those lost years never disappeared. Writers, reformers, and historians would often look back to the early 1700s and call it the Age of Madness. They spoke of mothers who forgot their children, men who drank away entire fortunes, and streets that smelled of death and juniper. The phrase, "mother's ruin," became a nickname for gin, a bitter reminder of how addiction could turn love into destruction. Artists like William Hogarth continued to paint the faces of those who suffered, ensuring that London would never forget what it had done to itself. In Parliament, Politicians used the gin craze as a warning for future generations, that any nation, no matter how rich or powerful, could fall apart if its moral foundation cracked under the weight of temptation and greed. In the decades that followed, England's economy began to shift again. Industry grew, trade expanded, and new opportunities gave people hope beyond the bottle. Beer replaced gin as the drink of the common man, and the middle class began to rise. But for those who remembered the streets of St. Giles, Bethnal Green, and Soho during the gin years, the memories stayed sharp, the crying of children, the shouting of drunkards, the endless nights filled with fear and sickness. These stories were passed down through families, told in whispers to remind the young why the city once nearly destroyed itself. London had been reborn, but its soul carried the faint taste of juniper, a ghost that would never fully fade. The lesson of the gin craze spread far beyond England. Across Europe and later in America, governments watched the British experiment and learned from its mistakes. They saw that addiction could not be cured by punishment alone, that laws without compassion only breed rebellion. Public health, moral reform, and education became tools for progress. Slowly, a new understanding began to take hold, that people needed more than laws to stay strong. They needed purpose, dignity, and hope. The story of gin became a symbol, a warning that when despair meets easy pleasure, entire civilizations can crumble without realizing it. Today, when you walk through the modern streets of London, past the glittering pubs, the glowing windows of bars, and the laughter that fills the night, it's easy to forget that these same streets once echoed with misery. Beneath the cobblestones and the charm lies a buried history of madness and mourning. The city we know today was built over the graves of that forgotten age, an age when gin ruled every corner of life and death. But perhaps that's why London endures. It learned, painfully and slowly, that progress without humanity is hollow, and pleasure without control is poison. So as the night deepens and the echoes of history grow faint, remember the tale of Georgian London, a city that drank itself to the edge of ruin and somehow found the strength to rise again. The story of its fall and rebirth is not just about a drink or a law or a forgotten time. It is about us, about how easily we lose our way when comfort becomes more important than conscience, and how redemption always begins when we choose to see clearly again. And so, dear listener, as we close this chapter, remember, history is never just the past. It's a mirror. And sometimes, when we look closely enough, we see ourselves staring right back. And as centuries passed, the memory of that gin-soaked London began to fade from daily conversation, but it never truly vanished. Every time a glass was raised in celebration or despair, somewhere deep within England's collective soul, the shadow of the past flickered, a faint reminder of what once happened when a drink became a nation's master. The cobblestone streets that once ran with spilled gin were cleaned, the air grew clearer, and laughter returned to the taverns. Yet beneath the charm of progress and modern prosperity, a quiet truth remained: people are always one small choice away from repeating the same mistakes that history tried to teach them. The story of the gin craze was not just a tale about addiction or crime, it was about human nature itself. About how easily comfort can turn into dependency, how quickly the desire for escape can swallow reason, and how a society's greatest threat often comes not from outside, but from within. The people of Georgian London didn't wake up one day and decide to destroy their city. It happened slowly, quietly, one drink at a time, one law at a time, one compromise after another. What began as a clever economic policy, meant to weaken France and strengthen England, became a moral and social tragedy. That's how decline often begins, not with chaos, but with small, well-intentioned steps. The government had wanted prosperity, instead, it unleashed despair. The poor had wanted comfort, instead, they found destruction. The rich had wanted profit, instead, they inherited guilt. By the time the city realized what had happened, it was too late to save the lost generation that had already perished in Jin's cruel embrace. And yet, from the ashes of that suffering rose something powerful, awareness. Londoners began to understand that progress could not be measured by wealth alone, that morality and mercy were as essential to survival as law and order. The churches that reopened after the Jin years became more than houses of worship, they became sanctuaries of reform, places where broken souls were given food, warmth, and a second chance. The early reformers who once walked through the slums of St. Giles and Bethnal Green, holding lanterns through the fog, carried not just prayers but purpose. They gave the city back its conscience. Slowly, compassion returned where cruelty had once ruled. Education began to replace ignorance, and care began to replace corruption. London, though scarred, began to heal, proof that even in the darkest corners of history, humanity has the strength to rebuild. Over time, the story of the Jin Age transformed into a warning told to new generations, a parable of how quickly progress can rot without principle. Parents told their children of Judith Dufour, of Mary Young, of the faceless poor who drank themselves into oblivion. Teachers spoke of William Hogarth's Gin Lane, not as a painting, but as a mirror showing what happens when society forgets to care for its weakest. Politicians studied the old Jin Acts to learn how policy without empathy can destroy more than it saves. And storytellers, like us tonight, continue to keep these memories alive, not to judge, but to remember. Because remembering is what keeps history alive. It's what keeps us from repeating it. London today stands tall, a shining city of lights, glass towers, and endless ambition. But beneath every step, under every stone and alleyway, lies the memory of the gin-soaked madness that once consumed it. It's part of the city's soul, buried but breathing, whispering reminders to anyone who dares to listen. And if you listen closely enough, when the night is quiet and the rain falls softly over the old streets of Soho or Covent Garden, you might still hear the echoes, the laughter, the crying, the clinking of glasses that once brought both joy and ruin. So as you sit here, listening in the comfort of your own time, take a moment to reflect. Every age has its own form of gin, its own sweet escape that promises peace and delivers pain. For Georgian London, it was a bottle. For us, it may be something different, greed, distraction, indulgence, or the endless chase for more. But the lesson remains the same, that when we lose balance, when we trade compassion for comfort, and humanity for profit, we risk creating our own gin lane all over again. And so, dear listener, as this story draws to a close, remember the people who lived and died in those streets, not as monsters or fools, but as reflections of ourselves. Their fall became our warning, and their suffering became our guide. London's madness ended, but its memory lives, a haunting yet hopeful reminder that even at our worst, we can find our way back. History, after all, is not just what happened. It's what keeps happening. As the centuries drifted on, the faces of Georgian London vanished, but their stories remained carved into the city's bones. Every street that once echoed with cries and laughter became part of a larger memory, one that London could never erase. The River Thames, which had once carried barrels of gin and bodies of the forgotten poor, now flowed quietly beneath bridges of progress. The fog that once hid sorrow became the city's most poetic disguise. Visitors came from around the world to marvel at London's beauty, never knowing that beneath its grandeur lay the buried ghosts of an age drunk on despair. But London, in its own mysterious way, carried that guilt with grace. It didn't run from its past, it learned to live with it. The city that had once drowned itself in gin became a city of thought, reform, and art. Its poets turned pain into verse. Its painters turned shame into beauty. Its philosophers turned suffering into wisdom. That transformation, from chaos to conscience, became the true legacy of Georgian London. It was no longer a story of drunkenness, but of awakening. No longer a tale of destruction, but of understanding. Even the British Crown, once indulgent and careless, began to change. The later monarchs of the 19th century inherited not only the throne but the lessons of that earlier age. They understood that leadership required more than privilege, it required empathy. The people, too, began to demand it. The cries that had once gone unheard during the gin craze found new power in the voices of reformers, activists, and writers. London, once a city of silence and suffering, became a city of dialogue and demand. From that brokenness came reform movements, women's voices, and the first whispers of equality. The fall of Georgian London had planted seeds that would grow into the conscience of modern Britain. Still, some shadows never fully disappear. Even today, addiction, poverty, and loneliness walk the same streets, only dressed in different clothes. The pubs have become clubs, the bottles have changed their labels, but the search for escape remains the same. The city that once drank itself to madness now drowns in other kinds of noise, digital, emotional, invisible. Yet somewhere between those lights and sounds, London still remembers. The past lingers not as a warning, but as a quiet companion, a voice saying, "Be careful how easily comfort can become your cage." The story of the gin craze is not about alcohol alone. It is about what happens when humanity forgets its balance, when a nation's soul bends beneath the weight of its own choices. It's about power used without compassion, pleasure sought without restraint, and suffering ignored until it screams. But it's also about resilience, the unbreakable strength of the human spirit to rebuild, to reflect, and to rise again. London did not die in that age of madness. It was reborn through the pain of its people, through their mistakes and their redemption. And perhaps that is what makes it such a timeless city, not its wealth, but its memory. Tonight, as you imagine those candlelit streets, the echo of laughter in the taverns, the cold fog rising over the Thames, remember that history is not distant. It breathes through us, quietly shaping the way we live, love, and lose ourselves. The same choices made in those centuries past are the ones we face today, only in different forms. The lesson remains unchanged: every civilization, no matter how grand, must guard its heart as fiercely as it guards its crown. And so, as this story reaches its end, imagine the lights of Georgian London slowly dimming. The music fades, the crowds vanish, and the sound of rain returns. In that silence, you can almost hear the city whisper its confession, a story of ruin, repentance, and rebirth. A city once drunk on its own excess found clarity not in its laws, but in its conscience. It learned that true strength is not in domination. As dawn broke over the skyline of a changing world, London stood tall again, older, wiser, quieter. The chaos that once ruled its nights had faded into history's deep sleep, but its lessons still echoed through the centuries. Every generation that followed carried a fragment of that old madness within them, a reminder of what happens when a city forgets its soul. The cobblestones that once trembled under the feet of desperate men and women now carried the rhythm of a new era. Horses had given way to carriages, carriages to cars, and yet, the stories remained, whispered through the wind that moved down narrow alleys, across bridges, and through time itself. The ghosts of Georgian London did not vanish with the passing of years. They lingered quietly, not to haunt, but to teach. In every pub where laughter rings too loud, in every dark corner where someone seeks escape from pain, those invisible witnesses still stand, watching, remembering. They carry the weight of a truth too heavy to forget, that pleasure, when left unchecked, becomes poison, and that comfort, when worshipped, becomes a cage. London had to die a little before it could learn how to live again. And from its death rose something extraordinary, compassion. A simple, fragile word that rebuilt a city brick by brick. The streets that once reeked of despair became the heartbeat of a new movement. Artists, writers, and reformers gave voice to the voiceless. They wrote poems about the forgotten, painted portraits of the broken, and built schools where ignorance once reigned. The spirit of the people who had once been crushed by gin's cruelty found new life in the age of enlightenment. From sorrow came wisdom, from decay, beauty. The same city that once drowned in darkness now shone as a symbol of rebirth, proof that no fall is final if a people have the courage to rise. But history, as it always does, continued to circle back. Each century brought its own form of intoxication, new pleasures, new distractions, new ways to forget. The bottles changed, the poisons evolved, yet the craving remained. Humanity's thirst for escape is endless, and the ghosts of the past sigh every time we repeat the same mistakes. London's lesson was meant for the world, that civilization can crumble not through invasion or war, but through quiet neglect of the human heart. And when comfort blinds us to compassion, when greed outweighs gratitude, we begin to walk the same drunken path once again, only under brighter lights. Still, there is hope. Always hope. For every age that falls into madness, there comes another that seeks redemption. That is what makes the story of Georgian London timeless. It is not a tragedy without end, but a cycle that demands awareness. It is a reminder that humanity's strength lies not in perfection, but in its ability to remember and rebuild. The people of that age, broken and lost though they were, left behind more than ruins. They left behind a warning wrapped in courage, a message written between the cracks of time: never forget what happens when the poor are ignored, and pleasure becomes more precious than people. And so, as the lights of modern London shimmer against the night sky, their reflection dances on the surface of the Thames, the same river that once carried barrels of gin, now carrying history's quiet tears. The city stands reborn, its laughter no longer hollow, its silence no longer haunted. But beneath every brick, beneath every echo, lies the heartbeat of the past, still pulsing, still whispering, still reminding. This is the legacy of a drunken court, a mad city, and a people who lost everything, only to rediscover their humanity. The fall of Georgian London was not the end, it was the beginning of understanding. It taught the world that progress without empathy is decay, and that the truest form of strength is not power, but compassion. And if you listen closely, on a quiet London night, you might still hear it, the distant clinking of glasses, the faint hum of sorrow, and beneath it all, the soft voice of a city that once fell into darkness, rising again to say, remember us. Learn from us. And never let history drink itself blind again. Centuries may have passed since the last gin barrel rolled through London's cobbled streets, yet the echoes of that era still live quietly beneath the city's skin. The fog that drifts over the Thames carries more than mist, it carries memory. If you stand on one of London's old bridges at night, and listen closely between the hum of the modern world, you can almost hear it, the faint laughter of the drunk, the cries of the forgotten, and the sighs of those who tried to save a city from itself. History does not vanish, it lingers, reshaping itself into lessons for those willing to hear. Every empire believes it is unbreakable. Every government trusts its order will stand forever. Yet in Georgian London, it wasn't war, disease, or invasion that nearly brought a great city to its knees, it was neglect. The neglect of the poor, of morality, of the simple understanding that people cannot be governed by greed alone. The gin craze was never truly about alcohol, it was about despair. It was about a nation that gave its people no choice but to drink to forget. And when a society's heart grows numb, its fall is only a matter of time. But from the ashes of that madness rose something that would redefine Britain forever. The reforms that followed, new social laws, moral awakenings, public health measures, education reforms, were born not from brilliance, but from guilt. Guilt that lingered in the conscience of those who had watched a generation dissolve in gin's embrace. The social thinkers of the late 18th century, the poets, the artists, the reformers, carried within them the shadows of that lost age. William Hogarth's haunting art, Henry Fielding's writings, the rise of Methodist preachers, they were all attempts to heal the moral wound that gin had carved into London's soul. And so, the city began to rebuild itself not with stone or steel, but with self-awareness. The people who had once turned away from the suffering around them began to open their eyes. The same streets that once reeked of ruin became pathways for change. Out of misery came movement, out of drunken chaos came reform. The gin-soaked slums gave birth to social conscience, an understanding that civilization cannot survive if compassion is treated as a luxury. Even today, when you walk through London, the past breathes through every shadow. The old workhouses stand as silent witnesses. The narrow alleys whisper stories of mothers, children, thieves, and dreamers who all shared the same poison. The taverns that once promised escape now serve as museums of memory, their walls heavy with ghosts that time could not erase. The tragedy of Georgian London is not a tale trapped in the past, it's a mirror held up to every generation that forgets the value of empathy. Because history repeats itself in quieter ways. Every addiction, every moral blindness, every greed-fueled policy that forgets the poor, they are modern echoes of that same old madness. The bottles may look different now, the streets may shine brighter, but the struggle between humanity and its hunger for escape remains unchanged. And perhaps that is why we must keep telling this story. To remember that no society is immune to collapse. To remember that progress without compassion is simply another kind of intoxication. And to remember that the fall of Georgian London was not merely the fall of a city, it was the fall of conscience, and its eventual rebirth. They were London's redemption. They stood against the tide of addiction and misery, believing that a city could heal if its heart remembered how to feel. They planted the first seeds of the social change that would one day reshape Britain. And though their names are often forgotten, their courage still echoes through time. As centuries passed, the city learned to breathe again. The gin shops closed, the laws changed, and the streets that once reeked of decay began to bloom with new life. Factories replaced the cellars, schools replaced the taverns, and the children who once wandered drunk and hungry grew up to build a new London, one with a conscience. The very people who had once been broken became the architects of rebirth. That is the secret power of history, it destroys, but it also teaches. It hurts, but it also heals. And yet, the lesson is never complete. Because even now, in our glittering modern world, we drink different kinds of gin. We numb ourselves with screens, with noise, with endless consumption. We drown not in spirits, but in distractions. The old taverns may have vanished, but the same hunger remains, that aching void inside us that asks to forget, to escape, to be free of the weight of being human. Georgian London is gone, but its shadow stretches into every age. So perhaps that's why stories like this matter. They are not just memories, they are warnings written in the language of pain. They remind us that every empire falls when it forgets to care. They remind us that no policy, no invention, no wealth can save a civilization that loses its empathy. And they remind us that the smallest act of compassion, a hand extended, a voice raised, a truth told, can save more lives than any law ever could. As the mist rises from the river and wraps itself around the city's ancient stones, we end where we began, in silence. A silence filled not with sorrow, but with understanding. For within that silence lies the heartbeat of humanity. So tonight, as you drift to sleep, let this story linger. Let it whisper through your dreams like a ghost that carries both warning and hope. The madness of Georgian London was not the end, it was a mirror. And when we look into it, may we see not just who we were, but who we still have the power to become. And as the echoes of that era fade into the twilight, we find ourselves standing in the present, a world so different, yet so eerily familiar. The London of today, with its bright lights and unending rhythm, feels far removed from the grim, gin-drenched streets of centuries past. But beneath the noise of modern life, that same old heartbeat still pulses. The heartbeat of a city that knows what it means to fall, and what it takes to rise again. Every cobblestone in the oldest quarters of London carries a story. Some whisper of laughter and love, others cry softly with pain. The ghosts of the Georgian age still wander there, unseen, unheard, yet ever present. If you walk through the narrow lanes of Spitalfields at dusk or cross the river where the fog hangs low, you might feel it, the weight of memory pressing gently against the skin of time. The air itself remembers. It remembers the cries of children, the laughter of the drunk, the prayers of the desperate, and the silence of those who had given up hope. But out of that silence came something extraordinary, resilience. Humanity's greatest strength has always been its ability to rebuild, to learn, to remember. For every soul lost to the madness of gin, there was another who rose in defiance of despair. And their courage became the seed from which a new London was born. Schools replaced gin shops. Kindness began to fill the spaces where cruelty once thrived. The city learned that compassion is not weakness, it is the very foundation of civilization. History teaches us through pain. It shows us who we are when everything falls apart. The drunken chaos of Georgian London was not just a tragedy, it was a warning, one that still speaks across the centuries. Because the real intoxication was never the gin itself, it was the power, the greed, the hunger to escape reality. And that kind of intoxication is eternal. It changes its form, wears new faces, but it never disappears completely. It lives wherever people forget to feel. We live in a world that drinks differently now. We consume distraction instead of gin, approval instead of peace, power instead of love. The taverns are digital, the addiction invisible, but the effect, in its quiet way, is the same. We lose ourselves piece by piece, glass by glass, click by click. And that is why stories like this one matter. They remind us of the cost of forgetting, and of the beauty that can still rise from ruin. So let London's story live, not as a tale of shame, but as a tale of rebirth. Let it whisper to us through the centuries that no civilization, no matter how advanced, can survive without empathy. That no progress is worth the price of losing one's humanity. And that, even in the darkest hour, a city, a people, can find their way back to the light. When you next see the lights of London shimmer across the Thames, remember this: beneath that reflection lies a city that once drowned in its own sorrow and still found the strength to breathe again. The same strength lies within every one of us, to rise above our chaos, to heal what is broken, and to remember that the greatest victories are not written in gold, but in compassion. This was A Drunken Court Madness and the Fall of Georgian London, a story of despair, redemption, and the fragile miracle of survival. A story that reminds us that the line between ruin and rebirth is as thin as the rim of a glass, and as eternal as the human soul. And as the night settles over London once more, the city seems to breathe in silence, a silence heavy with memory. The fog curls around the lampposts like an ancient ghost. The laughter, the weeping, the desperate songs from the gin alleys, they have faded, yet they linger in the bones of the city. Every brick, every stone, carries the faint heartbeat of a world that once danced on the edge of madness. In those days, the lines between royalty and ruin blurred like candlelight through smoky glass. The courts of kings and queens were not so different from the taverns of the poor, both driven by excess, both blind to consequence. The same laughter echoed through palaces and cellars alike, as if all of London were intoxicated by its own decay. The court's drunken spectacles became metaphors for the city itself, a place drowning in indulgence, unable to distinguish between pleasure and poison. But amid the chaos, there were still those who dared to dream of light. Quiet figures, mothers who hid their children from the gin shops, writers who used ink instead of fists, and reformers who spoke truth even when no one wanted to listen. They believed that London could change. That humanity could rise above its own darkness. And though they were few, their courage rippled across time like the faint glow of dawn breaking through fog. By the end of the 18th century, the city began to awaken. The gin acts brought regulation, the voices of reason found ears to hear, and slowly, painfully, the madness began to fade. But the scars remained. London would carry them forever. They would live on in its art, its literature, its soul. Dickens would later capture that ache, that strange mix of guilt and grace, in the stories that made the world remember what London once was. And perhaps that is the truest legacy of Georgian London, not the grandeur of its architecture or the elegance of its nobility, but the lessons carved into its suffering. The reminder that progress built upon pain must always remember where it began. That beauty born from ruin must never forget the ruin itself. When you walk today through the quiet streets of Westminster, or stand at the steps of St. Paul's as the evening bells ring, you can almost hear it, that echo of the past. The faint laughter of the drunkards, the cry of the hungry, the sigh of the weary. They have become part of London's song, haunting, but human. And through them, the city tells us a story not of shame, but of transformation. For every fall leaves a lesson, and every ruin hides a seed of rebirth. London fell, but it rose again, stronger, wiser, and more compassionate. Its story is a mirror held up to all of us, showing how easily we can lose ourselves, and how powerfully we can begin again. History, in the end, is not just about the dead. It is about the living, about us. The people who inherit both the glory and the guilt of those who came before. And so, the drunken court, the madness, the despair, they all fade into the distance, leaving behind a single truth, that no city, no heart, is beyond redemption. And as the final light flickers out over the Thames, the fog parts for just a moment, revealing not the ruins of the past, but the quiet promise of tomorrow. The city sleeps, but it dreams, of the lessons it learned, of the pain it survived, and of the endless, stubborn hope that keeps humanity alive. And so, as the mists of time drift away, the echoes of Georgian London dissolve into the heartbeat of a city forever changed. The drunken laughter of the past has long gone quiet, replaced by the steady rhythm of modern life, yet somewhere, deep beneath the cobblestones, that pulse still remembers. It remembers the cries, the songs, the confusion of a people lost in their own search for escape. It remembers a world that almost forgot how to feel. In every age, there comes a moment when humanity must choose between indulgence and awakening. For Georgian London, that moment was carved in gin, a bitter drink that revealed a sweeter truth, that pain, when faced, becomes transformation. We often think history is made by kings and parliaments, by wars and decrees. But more often, it is shaped in silence, in the choices of ordinary souls who refuse to let the world remain cruel. The nameless mothers who poured out the gin instead of their hearts. The preachers who spoke of mercy when no one wanted to listen. The writers who turned their pens into torches, lighting the dark corners of truth. It was they who changed London, not through noise, but through compassion. The court may have been drunk on its own grandeur, but time is a patient judge. Every empire built on arrogance eventually sobers to the truth. The gilded halls where laughter once drowned out reason now stand as quiet museums, their portraits staring blankly into eternity, faces painted in pride, yet shadowed with regret. The chandeliers still sparkle, but they illuminate ghosts. And yet, those ghosts are not meant to frighten us, they are meant to remind us. They whisper that progress is fragile, that empathy is sacred, and that no amount of wealth or glory can protect a civilization that forgets its humanity. Georgian London's fall was not a punishment, it was a lesson, written in the language of pain, meant for every generation that would follow. Today, the Thames flows calmly beneath bridges that gleam with light, but its waters have carried everything, the laughter of kings, the cries of beggars, the ashes of revolution, and the quiet prayers of redemption. The river does not judge. It simply remembers. And perhaps that is all history ever asks of us, to remember. To remember the madness, so that we may cherish the calm. To remember the suffering, so that we may honor the healing. To remember the fall, so that we may never take our rise for granted. And if you listen closely, when the city sleeps and the night wind brushes against the old stone walls, you may still hear it, faint, distant, eternal, the whisper of a world that once lost itself, and then found its way home. A drunken court madness and the fall of Georgian London, a story not just of a city, but of us all. A reminder that no darkness is endless, no heart is beyond redemption, and no civilization truly falls if it still remembers how to rise. And as dawn breaks over the sleeping city, a soft golden light touches the rooftops of London, the same rooftops that once watched over the madness of gin and the cries of the desperate. The air feels different now, gentler, as if the city itself has learned to breathe again. The wind glides through the narrow lanes, carrying not the scent of decay, but the quiet fragrance of remembrance. The world has moved on, but the memory lingers, not as a wound, but as a whisper. The ghosts of Georgian London do not haunt with anger, they walk quietly beside us, watching, waiting, reminding. In the rush of modern life, the cars, the lights, the endless screens, we rarely notice them. But they are there. Every time a child laughs in freedom, every time a hand reaches out in kindness, every time someone chooses compassion over cruelty, they smile. Because that is the victory they never lived to see. History does not end, it transforms. The drunken court became the sober conscience of a nation. The gin palaces turned to galleries and schools. The cries of the poor became the voices of reform. And the same streets that once drowned in despair now hum with life, with art, with hope. The story of London is the story of becoming, of learning that every civilization must first fall in order to understand what truly makes it stand. Yet, beneath all progress lies a warning. The same desire that once led to destruction still lives within us, only hidden, wearing new faces. We chase pleasure, we build walls of luxury, we numb ourselves from pain. And though the bottles may be gone, the thirst remains. The lesson of Georgian London whispers to us even now, beware of forgetting what it means to be human. For the real fall of any city does not begin with riots or ruin. It begins when people stop caring. When comfort replaces compassion. When memory fades into convenience. That is when the ghosts begin to stir again. And they always return, not to punish, but to remind. So perhaps, when night falls over London and the streetlights shimmer upon the Thames, you will pause, just for a moment. You will feel that ancient heartbeat beneath your feet. You will hear the echoes of laughter and sorrow blending into one eternal melody, the song of survival. Because that is what London is, not a monument of power, but a living poem of endurance. It is the proof that even in chaos, beauty can rise. That from the ashes of excess, empathy can bloom. That a city, like a soul, can be broken 1,000 times and still find the courage to rebuild. And as we close this story, let us carry its truth with us. The story of a drunken court, a fallen city, and a people who found redemption in their ruin. The story of how the darkest nights give birth to the brightest mornings. The story of London, and of every heart that has ever struggled, fallen, and dared to rise again. Because in the end, history is not a collection of dates and names. It is a mirror, and when we look into it, we do not just see the past, we see ourselves. As the first light of morning touches the city, London breathes again. The ghosts of its past sink quietly into the river, their voices fading into the hum of the living. The drunken laughter, the cries, the sorrow, all become part of the city's eternal heartbeat. Cut to, the old cobblestones glistening with dew. A street empty, yet alive with memory. Once, this city drowned in its own madness. Once, its people forgot what it meant to care. But from the ashes of excess, compassion rose, fragile, trembling, yet unstoppable. Camera tilts up, a single ray of sunlight breaks through the clouds, striking the cross atop St. Paul's Cathedral.